Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel. Welcome to Quantum Froth Dispatches. And I know that I said I was going to put them out more frequently, but I actually have a pretty good reason this time why they're not out there. Not that the other reasons weren't that great, but this is actually really good. And it's because my writer's cup overfloweth. I've actually gotten some really good writing assignments. I have a lot of stuff on the horizon coming out for publication. And along those lines, I want to plug Gunfight on Europa Station, which is a new sci-fi Western anthology out from Baen, November 2nd. You can pre-order it now. Please do. I have a short story in there called The Penultimate Stand of Pina Gracchi about two mercenaries that find themselves in a situation they hadn't really signed up for. I am actually really surprised that my story got into this anthology, considering the other writers in there. It's unbelievable, the list of people that are in there. I'm really, really honored to be included in their number. And you can pick that up wherever fine books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. Which if you order from them, I think they have the best price right now. They actually help out your local bookstore. So that's a pretty good place. But it's sold pretty much everywhere. So please pre-order that, and it comes out November 2nd. All right, so with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I want to get into what I've been calling, for lack of a better name, the Gen X problem. And this is going to be a long ramble. So I'll explain in a little bit.
Skybird, this is Dropkick with a red dash alpha message in 2 parts. Break.
5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. Human beings are wired for story. In fact, there's a book with the same title, Wired for Story by Lisa Cron, which offers some pretty good craft advice for authors, so check it out. Anyway, we're wired for story. That's how the brain is set up. The brain automatically relies on past information to look for causal patterns, to evaluate and assign agendas, to potential competitors, predict the future, and achieve its goals, right? So the brain receives information that is apparently unconnected. When that happens, it will create those connections, no matter how outlandish those connections might turn out to be. That's why gossip and conspiracy theories exist. A perfect example is the Pixar Theory, right? And the Pixar Theory, if you don't know what it is, it's basically saying that all the Pixar movies occur in a shared universe. Now, Pixar didn't say this. Pixar didn't do this. Fans did. And the scary thing is it kind of makes sense. You can Google it. It's pretty cool. Another one that a friend of mine just recently pointed out to me, I'd kind of heard about it, but I didn't know to the extent that people had gone with it, is the Tommy Westphall theory. And it's about how a ton of network TV shows are all interconnected and they're all occurring in Tommy Westphall's head, which is a reference to the ending of St. Elsewhere. So definitely check that one out. It would take an entire podcast episode to cover it. It's a lot of fun. And for those who don't know what St. Elsewhere was, it was like a medical drama, and it has one of the most infamous endings just about ever for a series finale. The show ends with a kid, an autistic kid, looking at a snow globe, and inside the snow globe is an identical replica of the building of St. Elsewhere, and it's implying that everything you saw on the show occurred in his head, in Tommy Westphall's head. And what the theory does is essentially goes, well, if St. Elsewhere occurred in Tommy Westfall's head, then all these other television shows that are somewhat tangentially connected to St. Elsewhere also occurred in Tommy Westfall's head. And it's kind of hilarious. So anyway, back to the brain. The brain likes to turn a bunch of random facts, perceptions, and beliefs into stories. The bad part is that once those stories are encoded within the brain becomes extremely resistant to change, especially in the face of something that directly contradicts the story the brain believes to be true. So then the brain views anything, or more importantly, anyone who challenges its established views as an existential threat, and it reacts appropriately. It needs to negate or destroy that threat. Incidentally, if you're a creator of any kind and you receive critique, pay special attention to your emotions when you're receiving any criticism of your work. Because if you react emotionally, that's your brain perceiving a threat, right? So if you react emotionally, that means the critic may have hit on a good point and you should probably address it. Now, they might still be wrong about what exactly doesn't work, but they are right that something isn't working. And if you don't react emotionally, then you either don't value their criticism or you don't care about that piece of your work. But either way, that's valuable information to know. Anyway, the brain creating connections and stories out of nothing isn't new information. People have known this for a long time. Certainly since before written history, right? So this is also why the news, which probably should be just a collection of cold, hard facts, which can be verified, they're not referred to as facts. They're referred to as stories. And as the era of infotainment continues, the presenters have to find the angle on the story. We've all heard that phrase, right? And every story needs a hero and a villain, regardless of the actual truth. And if the news story doesn't have one, the media will create them. They'll create heroes and villains out of whole cloth. So the brain's activity with story is so crazy that doctors and scientists have been able to demonstrate the same portions of the brain react to a vivid description of an activity as if that person was actually engaged in that activity. So if you're reading a particularly vivid passage about running a race, the same parts of your brain activate as if you were actually running the race, albeit with less intensity. But it does explain the popularity of many genres, like horror, right? Where a reader can experience all the terror and heart-pounding adrenaline, but they're safe. They're in the safety of a good novel. Too bad we can't burn the same calories reading about running a race, right? To say nothing of erotica, right? But we'll expound on our little detour, right? So stories, especially good stories, have a direct impact on the brain. It's the closest thing we come to a software upgrade or a patch for our thoughts, for our being, for our minds, right? So since the dawn of time, humans have told each other stories. Sometimes it was just to describe things they couldn't explain and impose a form of order on the chaos of the world. So every night, Ra descends into the underworld upon his solar barge and does battle with the Serpent Apep. If Ra wins, he rises in the east triumphant, and a small part of the world is reborn. Relatively harmless, not really critical information. If you're an Egyptian sculptor and you don't understand or never heard of this myth, the sun comes up anyway, you go about your business, no harm, no foul, right? But what if you're an Egyptian farmer? Then it might become very important indeed to track how many times Ra has fought Apep and across what parts of the sky the solar barge is traveling. And if you don't remember the stories that tell you which constellations to look for, well, you plant your crop at the wrong time. Your crop fails, you starve, and you die. We can go back farther, right? So when the hunting party comes back and tells the tale of the hunt, they aren't just conveying what they did. They're telling other hunters where the herd was, what tactics they used, which weapon worked best to bring down the most prey. The best versions get immortalized in myths and painted on cave walls where they interplay with the firelight and drums and flutes to ensure the story finds the best purchase within the mind. Then the new hunters, who might not have been tested in the real world, they still receive a measure of experience. Is it as good as having been on the hunt? Actually, no. But it's loads better than not having an experience at all. And as the stories get better, they get better. Because unlike their ancestors, they aren't running the hunt.exe. They've gotten a software patch, and they're running the Hunt 3.0 before they've even stepped away from the tribe or even hefted a spear. So the stories pass on information about medicine, which foods are safe to eat, how to deal with grief or a predator, or maybe even a situation that is super rare, but can nevertheless happen, and so you may never even run into it. But if you do, you can remember a story about how a hero dealt with that, right? And the tribe stays fed, or crops get planted at the right time, and a civilization prospers. And the ability to tell good, compelling stories that pass on valuable life experiences becomes a survival trait. And other fictions arise, which enable more and more people to cooperate with or against one another. So the human imagination and the ability to tell stories becomes the method to motivate large groups of humans to cooperate towards a common goal. And we all know what we're talking about. I mean, we see it every day. Do it for God. Do it for the state. Do it for money. Our tribe is better than their tribe. They are wicked because they believe different stories than we do. So, as a further example, remember the recent Robinhood and GameSpot stock manipulation thing that was going on? People understood GameSpot wasn't a Fortune 500 company. They were play acting in a common story. But no one actually questioned the roots of the fiction, whether or not money is real, right? Even though the dollars traded were completely ephemeral. They didn't really exist. They were just digital, right? But that fiction stood firm because, well, when people start to believe that fundamental fictions like money don't exist, that's usually curtains for that civilization. So, back on point, with story becoming so important, first as a survival mechanism, then as a means of unifying a large group towards a common goal, it starts to follow the better the stories, the more successful the group. And a correlation that the group who tells the better stories has more success than those who don't. And then it follows after that bad stories die out with societies who told them, because the societies who are telling bad stories, they don't last, which implies that some methods of storytelling are better than others. And the ones that are still around tend to be really good. So all that to say that some story forms are better than others at conveying information vital to society. And the monomyth, the hero's journey, the one documented by Joseph Campbell, that's one such story form. You know, it is present in just about every society and has been popular for thousands of years. It is extremely effective at conveying good and lasting and great stories. So why are a ton of modern storytellers rejecting it? Well, because perceived audience fatigue might be one reason. Like the superhero genre starts to flag and wind down right now. Audiences have gotten wise to the checkboxes used to tell these kind of stories. So the monomyth is never meant to be a checklist, but creators have been using it that way. And modern audiences are savvy, if nothing else. They'll pick it out. So, but there might be another reason, right? And it's because the monomyth story form is for conveying mythic stories, right? And modern storytellers, particularly when dealing with pop culture, they want the old mythic stories subverted and killed in favor of the new myths, which have not been proven and, in fact, I think present a significant societal risk. And that's what we've been seeing in the last couple of years. And what makes me say this? Well, it would be one thing if these like storytellers were fumbling with new stories, original works that we'd never heard that particular way before, and they were experimenting with new story forms and just riffing and trying things out. People do that all the time, and they fail spectacularly. But when they succeed, they also succeed spectacularly. So you look to Pulp Fiction and Tarantino's method of remixing ideas and concepts borrowed from other stories. There's a lot kind of just straight ripped off from other stuff in Pulp Fiction. But by doing that, he delivered an Elmore Leonard type film, which Elmore Leonard didn't have anything to do with, which is pretty cool. And for a while there, every other film was trying to be the next Pulp Fiction, right? But the folks we're talking about that are kind of doing things now, these aren't like neophyte or avant-garde experimental storytellers. They're massive corporations who employ people who should know better. And they aren't playing with tiny art films where filmmakers and audiences expect to experience experimental storytelling. They are compromising modern-day myths and some of the most popular stories ever told. And they're doing it intentionally. And they're doing it in bad faith. So, for a quick recap, stories have the capability to modify behavior both through passing on vital knowledge and even altering the brain functions of the audience. People experience real emotions when going through a well-told story. They even pass through the stages of grief, albeit in an accelerated manner, when a beloved character dies. Okay, so also, some means of storytelling are better at conveying the meaning of story than others, and good stories help civilizations, societies, and individuals survive and deal with life events by establishing a roadmap of previously successful patterns. Now, there used to be such a thing as a 4-quadrant story or movie, and it's still around. It hasn't gone away. It just looks like it's becoming a little bit more rare. But the 4-quadrant thing, that was the goal for a studio tentpole film, right? And the 4 quadrants varied, but generally they were old, young, female, and male. And if you had something in the film for all those demographics, it was a good bet you'd have a pretty big hit on your hands. Now, sometimes a film favored one of the demographics heavier than others, like Cocoon or Grumpy Old Men or 300, the older Disney films, or like 50 Shades of Grey. But in general, if you hit those quadrants, you're maximizing your audience as a film studio. And why is maximizing your audience important? Well, because it isn't tell me the best story you can, it's show business. So as a studio, if you maximize your audience, you maximize the money you make. And that's your goal, right? To make the most amount of money you can for the studio, for the stockholders. And the best way of maximizing your audience, and therefore your money, is to tell the best story you can. But now, the marketing seems to be sending messages which seem counterintuitive to that goal, right? This movie isn't for you. This movie isn't for such and such demographic. These people should stay at home. Don't come see our movie. This movie puts a subset of people in their place. It's interesting, right? And then they're not even trying to tell the best stories they can anymore. What we're getting instead are essentially first draft stories, just riddled with story problems grade schoolers could pick out and fix. They're $200 million extravaganzas where story is the least consideration from people who should know better. So why are they sabotaging themselves? Well, the first answer is that they don't want to maximize their audience anymore, which means they're not serious about maximizing profits any longer, which means they're acting against their own goals. So they're kind of bad actors, or they have other goals. Recently, there was a whiteboard leaked from a very, very famous IP like story group, right? And it had their priorities listed on what their latest iteration of that IP should cover, right? And basically how they were going to exploit that platform, quote unquote, to deliver an agenda. And good storytelling wasn't even listed. Now, great storytelling always has a deeper meaning at its core, right? The greater theme or moral to convey, and that's what turns it from like an anecdote or just plain entertainment to something greater. something mythic, something that transcends the medium and contributes to the human experience. But when the agenda comes at the expense of the story, well, what you have then is propaganda. And sometimes that's harmless, like, hey, go buy this product, right? And sometimes, well, it's not harmless and it's destructive. But remember how I said we were wired for story? Well, it turns out audiences have a decent BS detector, because figuring out what was a good story or not is the trait that leads to success and survival. And if you choose poorly and you learn the wrong lesson, well, you don't survive the winter, your line dies with you. So a lot of audiences are rejecting these new stories. Now, consider that people do not get upset at things they don't care about. And also consider the brain goes into attack mode when challenged by anything that disagrees with it, or when it fears, right? And we have been directly warned about this. Where? Well, from our modern myths. But we weren't really paying attention. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Remember that? I've been a fan of various franchises my entire life. My best friends are fans. Some of my favorite activities used to be about getting into crazy debates and arguments involving like fanish hypotheticals. Who is the best starship captain? Could the Enterprise win against the Star Destroyer? Not that you asked, but it's pretty obvious, and the answers are Kirk and yes, respectively. But now, the word fan has been assigned kind of a negative connotation, and it's usually prefaced by the word toxic. There are exceptions as always, but that's kind of a fiction too, isn't it? And if you do a quick search for the term toxic fan, you're going to come up with the same movies and articles using extremely similar language. Almost like there was an agreed upon talking point disseminated to shape a desired story. Remember, the media needs heroes and villains. So in the Dramatica method of story analysis, they view a complete story as a mind trying to resolve a problem. And this meshes well with like the Hegelian concept of the dialectic. Roughly speaking, Hegel advocated taking a point and writing a thesis supporting it, and then writing an antithesis against it, and pitting the two against one another. And in that way, you come up with the truth. So, according to Dramatica, in much the same way, a good story can pit a protagonist against an antagonist to create a dialectic and reveal a truth. The difference here is that a protagonist and antagonist aren't necessarily good or evil. Those terms aren't burdened by those kind of values, right? They simply oppose each other in their goals and probably in their point of view. So maybe a fan who doesn't like the direction a franchise is headed isn't evil. Maybe the person on the other side of the argument isn't a villain for believing that there are 4 lights instead of 5, or that maybe we haven't always been at war with East Asia. Maybe they're just wrong, or maybe they just have a different take on it. But in the last 5 years or so, across our entire society, people are not interested in antagonists and protagonists. They want heroes and villains, and that's becoming dangerous. And all this contributes to what I'm calling the Gen X problem, for lack of a better name. And it's kind of a doozy. So, take another quick aside. Recently, my friends and I were in Las Vegas for a Warhammer 40K event. And after the event, we went to a very swanky restaurant, as you do. And the restaurant featured extraordinary food coupled with appropriately extraordinary prices. But there was something strange about it. One might expect that kind of place to have like a piano bar or something like that. And instead, they had a DJ playing some equally extraordinarily loud music. Like, so loud it was nearly impossible to have a conversation. So you'd think it might be something electronica-based, maybe EDM or something like that. Nope. It was I Will Survive, and the Spice Girls, and American Pie, and Sweet Home Alabama. And everyone was encouraged to sing along, which meant if you were trying to have a conversation anyway, and were struggling to be heard over the din, the instant the entire restaurant chimed in, forget about it. Now, the cynic in me was instantly reminded of one of Ford Prefect's theories about humans in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If they don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. Well, we can't have people thinking in this day and age, right? But honestly, I think it came down to the restaurant management just wanting to ensure everyone had a good time, right? So it's hard to have a bad time if you're trying to talk to your party and they can't hear you. And it's hard to have a bad time if every time you try and Sweet Caroline, ba, ba, ba. Anyway, I started looking around and noticed the restaurant was, in its own way, a little microcosm of what I'm calling the Gen X problem. There were some millennials there, yeah. And the majority of patrons, though, were Gen X and boomers. Well, why? Well, because they're the ones who could overwhelmingly afford to eat there. So the music was all part of the plan. One of the easiest ways to tap into nostalgia is through music. Just ask Lana Del Rey. I mean, she's so good at it, she makes you feel nostalgia for places you've never been, people you've never met, things you've never done, right? And that's one part of the Gen X problem, nostalgia. And it comes from the Greek, algos, meaning pain or grief, and nostos, meaning homecoming or returning, a bittersweet longing for things, persons, or situations of the past. And we, my friends, are mired. The member berries, as South Park named these appeals to nostalgia, they're powerful and they're lucrative. So part one of the Gen X problem is nostalgia. Nostalgia wins the day and makes it so you have a pretty good chance of putting out a successful, read that as money-making, creation. It's not a big risk. Part two of the Gen X problem. Gen X has expendable income, and we will spend money on lots of stuff to tap into those feelings of nostalgia. Now, it may sound like I'm bashing Gen X, but if you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, you know I'm a huge nerd. I collect all sorts of, collectibles, not least of all replica movie props to allow me to connect to my favorite films. I literally memorize movies to the point that at one time my friends and I could communicate solely in movie quotes. So I'm firmly within Gen X. This is my problem. I mean, who do you think Hasbro's marketing their Black Series Star Wars figures to? Gen X. Who else, right? Why do you think they reissued the Hero Quest board game or made a Nerf gun toy from a movie that came out in 1986? Gen X. If you've got the money, honey, we've got your disease. It should be kind of reversed, for this illustration, but that's from a Guns N' Roses song, one of the high school anthems of, you guessed it, Gen X. And our motto should be like Gen X. We buy stuff. We consume. So who am I exactly talking about when I say Gen X? Well, we were all born in the 1900s. That sounds so insane saying that particular way. But roughly speaking, we were born from like 1965 to about 1980, give or take a few years. We're the kids used to coming home to an empty house to watch reruns of Get Smart and Bewitched while waiting for G.I. Joe and Transformers to come on, while consuming microwave pizza rolls. In Eastern Europe and Russia, we were the last of the Soviet children. We grew up firmly under the threat of nuclear annihilation, and our pop culture reflected that threat with movies like War Games and songs like It's a Mistake. But we also learned the words glasnost and perestroika, and we saw the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain collapse. We are the latchkey kids, the slackers, the MTV watchers, the luck wearers, and the barrel riders. Well, okay, maybe not the last two. But as a quick aside, when WandaVision debuted on Disney Plus, I wondered who the target audience was. I was like, who was watching WandaVision, who knew what the Dick Van Dyke Show and I Love Lucy looked like, who had watched Bewitched, and the Brady Bunch, and Full House? Well, the answer is kind of self-explanatory. We were also the generation of the first home computers, BBSs, arcades, and towards the end there, AOL and the nascent internet. and also the satanic panic, which makes us wary when we start to see other witch hunts arise. And we were also the first generation to grow up in the post-civil rights battle era. We grew up without Jim Crow and anti-miscegenation laws. We grew up watching shows that weren't afraid to talk about race directly, like All in the Family, Roots, Good Times, The Jeffersons. We grew up on ultra-macho heroes like Rambo, Conan, and Dutch, as they stood alongside unbelievably strong women like Ellen Ripley, Vasquez, Sarah Connor. We didn't care that Colonel Deering outranked Buck Rogers, or that Leia was the brains of the operation, or that Marion was Indy's partner and that he'd be much worse off without her, or that the scientist behind the Night Industries 2000 was named Bonnie. In fact, we loved them for it. We watched fighter pilots of myriad races and genders defeat Cylons way back in 1978. But from the state of a lot of media today, you'd think none of these things existed until about 5 years ago. Well, it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows, for sure. I mean, Newsweek ran the headline tackling a taboo when covering Spike Lee's film Jungle Fever, a film about interracial relationships. That was in 1991, just 30 years ago. Like, process that, right? We also grew up with nearly every show or movie having the added mandatory minority sidekick character, who was only ever rarely allowed to show heroic qualities themselves. So ever praises in abundance to Saint Lando of the Cloud City. This became so common it gave rise to token as a trope. It's so prevalent, especially in the movies of the 80s and 90s, and perhaps why we as Gen Xers tend to react poorly when we see the return of tokenization in pop culture today. This trope is so prevalent that the South Park creators hung a lantern on it by naming one of the only black characters on the show Token. And we grew up during perhaps the greatest decades of American filmmaking ever. I mean, that's the whole premise of this podcast, right? The films of 1982. So many classics in so short a time. Spread it out from 1980 to 1990, it's kind of unbelievable. The run continues right through 2000, especially among genre films. And some might even argue that if you're just counting genre films, it continues right up until today. We were raised smack in the middle and the heyday of the franchise mega sequels. And I think that's where the third part of the Gen X problem begins. See how I kind of brought it back there after a seemingly irrelevant detour? Hollywood doesn't like to take risks. Why? Because once again, it's not show art. It's show business. And in show business, where every project is an investment, and sometimes substantially so, studio heads want as close to a sure thing as they can get. Hollywood is a recycling industry. It always has been. How many times have we seen A Star is Born, or It's a Wonderful Life, or A Christmas Carol, or any variations of those stories, right? But Gen X could have been different. As I said before, we grew up during some of the most epic and creative explosions in American film. The franchise mega sequels that raised us influenced the world. Star Wars, Star Trek, Jaws. The flurry of films from 82 and a couple of years afterwards, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones. These are franchises which continue to shape pop culture right up to today. And that's kind of the problem. See, Gen X didn't make any of these. Sure, they dominated our imaginations and shaped our lives, but we didn't make them. Boomers did, or creatives older than them. And they, in turn, drew their inspiration from works that influenced and shaped their youths. So Star Wars comes from The Hidden Fortress and Kurosawa films and Flash Gordon and World War II and a smattering of Lucas's love for hot rods and cruising. Indiana Jones comes from Spielberg, Lucas, and Kasdan trying to recreate the serials of their youth, and adventure pictures like The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And yeah, there are some remakes thrown in there, The Thing, Cat People, but the majority of the films that shaped Gen X were original, And when they weren't, they were remixes rather than remakes. So like Jaws and Star Wars ushered in the era of the blockbuster. And then it was just a quick buck to pump out a sequel. So, and they rarely ever furthered the story. At best, they were just another adventure involving the characters and the audience in the world that the audience already knew, right? And at worst, they were just tired cash grabs that revisited thoroughly trodden territory. Very seldomly do sequels surpass the original, right? I can think of a few. The Empire Strikes Back, Aliens, a handful of others. And whether they eclipse the original is up for debate. But for those sequels that made money, there were more sequels to be had, right? Sequels became franchises. There had been franchises before. Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce made a decent trade as Sherlock Holmes and Watson across a slew of movies and radio shows. Abbott and Costello helped the studio recoup losses by reusing sets and even creatures in their famous like Abbott and Costello Meet the Blank, series of films. And they'd film their routines like alongside the more serious features, like using the same sets and everything. It's kind of crazy. But there had never been franchises like what came out in the 80s and the 90s, right? And some of the franchises continued an ongoing story, like Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and they form a trilogy. And some fell into the continuing adventures of blank, like Indiana Jones and James Bond. But more than enough fell into the cash grab category. Thought it was safe to go back in the water? Nope. Here's Jaws in 3D. And that has one of the most notoriously worst special effects of all time. But I'm sure the time crunch on those poor guys was horrendous, right? But wait, there's more. Jaws 4. Hope everyone got paid handsomely. And so on, up until today. But nowadays, the pretense of any storytelling looks to be gone. It looks like the goal of the franchise is simply to fall into the cash grab territory. And a proven pop property with a built-in fan base, well, that's just licensed to print money. So there's a movie out there that probably a whole lot of people haven't seen. And it's called Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And I think it was the 6th entry in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And I think it was Wes Craven's return to that franchise after the initial Nightmare on Elm Street. And the premise of this film is really kind of odd. And it is that the actors that played in A Nightmare on Elm Street are beginning to experience actual events in their lives, in the real world, tied to Freddy Krueger in the events of Nightmare on Elm Street. And so the actress Heather Langenkamp plays herself in the movie. And she starts to experience all this stuff about Freddy and goes to hunt down Wes Craven to find out what's going on. And the only rumors she can hear is that Wes is working on a new project. He's working on something new. And she, her life starts to unravel. She finally goes and confronts Wes. And Wes tells her that when he was originally writing A Nightmare on Elm Street and doing research for it, he uncovered some kind of an entity, right? And it was evil to the core, and it craved attention. And so Wes Craven and his assistants or whatever were able to trap this thing in a movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street. And the audiences gave it all the attention it desired, and it was basically stuck in there. It was trapped. But as people started making A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, Part 5, and the movies started getting diluted and less people cared about it or started mocking it. Hey, these were not horror movies anymore in the true sense. They became kind of slasher flicks, and audiences didn't respond the same way. The entity got out, and it was seeking out and attacking the people who had anything to do with the original Nightmare on Elm Street. And Wes Craven is telling Heather Langenkamp he needs her to be Nancy one last time, and he's working on a screenplay, a new movie to trap this entity. And I can't help but think how this kind of ties into what we're seeing now, right? These franchise mega sequels came out in the 80s and the 90s. People made sequels and spin-offs and everything and drove these things into the dirt. And now Hollywood is trying to resurrect these things to try to capture some of that original magic. But is it working? I don't know, right? But it is perceptively a license to print cash. And it's not Hollywood's fault. It's in their nature. Show business, remember? They're beholden to stockholders and to the people that work for them. That disastrous sequel that no one asked for, well, it's hopefully making enough money to help people pay bills and pay mortgages and pay for pensions. In theory, anyway, right? But like the 90s came along and there was a boom in independent film and features. Gen X's own crop of creatives began to sprout. And I don't know if all these people are genuinely Gen X, but they feel like they belong to Gen X. So people like Quentin Tarantino and Spike Jonze and David Fincher and Christopher Nolan and Taika Waititi and Jon Favreau and Steven Soderbergh and John Singleton and Kevin Smith. And I know I'm forgetting a ton of people. But they birthed a new era of filmmaking, like great independent films overflowing with creative energy. Now, some of them paid too much homage to other films. Kevin Smith, I'm looking at you. But they were still very much original. But then something happened. And my best guess is that it happened around like 95 or 96. I remember first noticing it in a Kevin Smith film called Chasing Amy, which I think came out in 96 or 97. And a lot of scenes in Chasing Amy are just reenactments of other scenes from Gen X's formative movies. There's a scene where two main characters compare scars they've received from past lovers. And it's a beat-for-beat recreation of the same scene from Jaws. And it's played for laughs by Smith because he knows who his audience is. It's Gen X, and we are these people. We speak in movie quotes. Our serious conversations revolve around pop culture. It's not just entertainment to us. It's a lifestyle. It's an identity. And I noticed it across sitcoms, too. I mean, we see restagings of scenes from Casablanca, the aforementioned Treasure of the Sierra Madre. How many times have we heard badges? We don't need no stinking badges. That's what that comes from. There are folks quoting On the Waterfront without even knowing where the original lines come from. It's gone on, and it's beyond out of control. And now you have quote-unquote successful programs like Family Guy, which exist almost exclusively as montages of callbacks to other works. I mean, how many jokes in Shrek rely on their contemporary pop culture to land? Maybe that's why they're talking about doing a Shrek remake / reboot, right? The previous generations hooked up Gen X with some of the most creative and incredible American films in history, but we didn't pass it on. And I got to thinking, what formative franchises did we, Gen X, pass on to the Millennials and Gen Z? And I'm sure I've forgotten some, but these are the ones I could come up with, right? The American Pie movies, The Matrix, The Fast and the Furious, Harry Potter, Twilight, and The Lord of the Rings. The Hunger Games, I'm sure I'm missing some, right? And out of all those, The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter seem to be the big formative ones, right? Because people sign their emails with like Proud Slytherin. So, well, what about the MCU and the DCEU, right? We could count those, except all those storylines those come from source material from the 80s and early 90s. So, oh well, if we knock those out, then The Lord of the Rings goes too, right? So we're left with not a lot. But you know what? We'll count the MCU and DCEU and The Lord of the Rings just to pad Gen X's numbers a little bit. But that's still kind of shameful. Because while some boomers might still be running the studios, the creatives with the power to make stuff right now are Gen X. And what have we chosen to do with that? We're not making new stuff. We're remaking our childhoods. And we're not remixing the core elements of the things we love to give birth to something new. Nope, just straight remakes, soft reboots, etc. A quick Google search reveals there's over 120 remakes or reboots currently in production. And I set my watch and warrant that number's low. So a lot of the remakes are totally unnecessary. You know they're remaking Dungeons & Dragons? Not the movie or the game, right? That old 80s cartoons about the kids and Dungeon Master and Tiamat and Venger and Uni. I'll probably watch it. Dune gets a pass because one could make a very good argument that despite David Lynch and the decent Sci-Fi Channel miniseries, Dune's never been really satisfactorily adapted to film. But they're also remaking Interview with the Vampire. I mean, really? In the last 30 years, there must have been no new vampire stories worthy of a film adaptation. We probably have such a shortage of vampire stories that we have to go back to Interview with the Vampire? I mean, this version is rumored to star Jacob Anderson, the guy who played Grey Worm in Game of Thrones, as Louis. I'm sure he'll do a great job and knock it out of the park, and I might be a bit biased, but I think he'd do a much better job as an immortal pharaoh taking down vampires in modern-day Miami. Shameless plug, the award-winning novel Graveyard Shift by yours truly, your friend and humble narrator, is available wherever fine books are sold and on audible.com. It's a good candidate for the next hit streaming series. Call me. Well, since 1979, there have been 8 Alien films, only one of which has featured colonial marines, one of the most popular aspects of the franchise. That alone is borderline criminal. In many ways, Aliens is a remake of its predecessor when you reduce the story beats to broad strokes, but Cameron remixed it and came up with an original action-packed story, thematically very different from the original. Zack Snyder did the same thing when he remade Aliens as Army of the Dead, but that's a podcast for another time. How many times do we need to see Uncle Ben die and Peter get bit by a radioactive spider? How many times do we need to see the Wayans get mugged and die in an alley? 9 Fast and the Furious films, not counting spin-offs, and the original in 1954, which, granted, is kind of just Fast and the Furious in name only. There have been how many Star Trek films? Which is also interesting because that's really 2 franchises split and conjoined into one. Because the Next Generation kind of became its own thing while still tethered to the original. And this is the part of the podcast where I reveal myself to be a bit of a hypocrite. But I'm Gen X, and I have no natural defense against these franchises. I love them. And while I wouldn't miss some of the Aliens films after Cameron's, I know plenty of people who would vehemently disagree with me. And I wouldn't part with The Dark Knight or Joker or the new Ocean's 11. And the MCU is a duller place without Spider-Man, even if it means another trilogy for Spider-Man. Yet another quick aside. Like, part of the reason both creatives and audiences like franchises is that we can become invested in the characters and the created worlds the stories take place in. We come to know these characters like dear friends. We celebrate with them when they triumph. We get frustrated by their setbacks and mourn when they die. In turn, when they're done right and the creators keep their promises, the characters show us in shorthand how to deal with problems in the real world. They inoculate us in microcosm with little bits of lessons on how to deal with critical life events, how to react in relationships, the loss of loved ones, and how to confront adversity. Little software updates. Remember that? Audiences, friends of the story who keep the creatives employed and the franchises lucrative, you might call them fans, begin to feel kinship and a sense of ownership over their favorite stories. This might sound like it's new, but it isn't. Arthur Conan Doyle famously caught a lot of flack after the incident at Reichenbach Falls. I'm pretty sure Homer caught some groans at the ordeals Odysseus suffered. Oh, and the Aeneid shows up as a sequel coming way after the fact and kind of no one asked for it. Was that a cash grab by Virgil? Anyway, how many sequels, portrayals, and spin-offs of Sherlock Holmes have there been? Easily thousands, right? There's baggage that comes with franchises, though. They, by definition, establish canon. And nowadays, there are a lot of people who view the word canon, along with the word fan, as bad. And fans can go too far, and canon has to be dialed in just right. If it's too rigid, it suffocates and it kills the story. Now, we could have a whole side conversation about what it's like creating art within limitations and how that could make your art better, but that's a discussion for another time. Having a loose canon, pun intended, allows anything to happen. Then there are no stakes. Nothing has to make sense, resulting in stories with no internal consistency, usually riddled with plot holes. And we're seeing that kind of thing far too often. And these stories don't last. They're good for your quarterly earnings, I guess, but you're losing out on profits you could make over decades. And just as you can't have lucrative franchises without dedicated fans, you can't have them without canon either. You can't have it both ways. Changing the canon is fine, and audiences will forgive you if you do it in a respectful manner. Retcons work. They can open up new avenues of storytelling. The key word has to be respect. And when creatives invalidate whole swaths of canon, or worse, declare that decades of canon no longer exist, well, they may believe that they've freed themselves from limitations and granted themselves the ability to tell new stories, but what they've actually done is told a large portion of the audience that their creation isn't worth investing any time in. And they'll lose that audience, which was the entire point of the franchise in the first place. That it comes with a built-in audience, remember? And when canon is disrespected in ways the audience perceives as whimsical, they feel betrayed. The franchise will falter and stop being lucrative. And keep in mind that most fans are only bothered by this because they care. If they didn't care, it wouldn't matter. Apathy is the death knell of a lucrative franchise. It is the emotional space where mythic journeys go to die. But how does that tie into our Gen X problem? Well, that's a good question. And this is a hard pill to swallow for Gen Xers, myself included. Listen close. We aren't the target audience anymore. But then why are they, or we, since most of the creatives with power out there are Gen X, incessantly revisiting or remaking old franchises? Did we really need 2 Masters of the Universe series out at the same time? Voltron? Well, and still no remake of Robotech? For shame. Anyway. Well, because even though Gen X might not be the target audience of the final product, we sure as hell are the target of the marketing. So the studios and corporations behind them are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they want to play it safe by exploiting known properties. On the other, they need to change those properties to appeal to the younger target audience. But in the process, they risk angering the original audience, who happen to be the ones with the cash money to buy all the merchandise crap associated with the original property. And where some would argue the real money is to be made. Again, why is Hasbro making a Nerf gun from a movie released in 1986? It's not to sell to Gen Z. So when Disney was deciding how they were going to build Galaxy's Edge, which is the Star Wars portion of the theme park, they asked the president of Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy, what she thought about the whole deal. And see, the original plan was to have Galaxy's Edge be based around the Star Wars original trilogy, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And Kathleen Kennedy thought different. And I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the exact quote in front of me. But the gist of what she said was something along the lines that there were way more Star Wars stories in the future than in the past. And they really couldn't keep clinging to the idea of what 50-year-olds thought Star Wars was. It was something like that. And she was absolutely right. And that plan would have worked too, if, well, for starters, if the folks helping to create future Star Wars stories had had a plan. But that's a discussion for another time. Chris Gore called it a creative malpractice, and I think that might be the most apt description of the franchise's mishandling I've ever heard. And Kathleen Kennedy's decision has another snag to it, though, right? And this is the key to the Gen X problem. A vacation to Disney is expensive, right? Seriously so. So who can afford to go there and bring their families there and buy all the merch? Well, it's 50-year-olds with expendable income. Gen X. Displease them at your peril, even though they aren't the target audience anymore. And then there's another snag that creatives do to themselves. See, they want to remake, reboot, and reimagine these old franchises so they can cash in on Gen X's sweet, sweet moolah. But then they often bring in people with only a superficial knowledge of the original property. And those people have an agenda. Not specifically any single agenda, but they tend to put that ahead of the story. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think the topic is fairly obvious to anyone paying attention. And I've talked about it earlier in the podcast, but it is important. So at the risk of repeating myself, the long and the short of it is that story has to come first. If you put agenda ahead of the story, that kind of story you're telling might be more of a fable or, more probably, especially nowadays, propaganda. And propaganda doesn't translate to entertainment dollars, even when people agree with it, not across the long term. Now, does that mean that a story can't have a higher meaning beyond simple entertainment? Absolutely not. Good speculative fiction should have a higher meaning attached to it. It provides a lens with which to view existing problems differently. It creates a safe space to argue about real-world problems and even maybe come up with solutions to them without directly confronting the real-world problem. It frees people of the real-world baggage surrounding an issue and poses questions in such a way that the brain doesn't perceive it as an attack and doesn't get defensive, allowing it to ponder the question in a more impartial manner. So that way, someone can watch an episode of Star Trek or Doctor Who or X-Men and learn the value of diversity or the ills of excessive capitalism or the struggle for gay rights without even knowing it. But lately, it seems propaganda is the order of the day, and you can sniff it out when the creatives start talking about platform. We're going to use this property as a platform for a cause. When you start hearing that, raise your shields. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. That kind of thinking stifles and kills good storytelling. They think this is the way to appeal to new audiences, but I don't think it's working the way they think it is. They're taking existing properties and changing them in ways that remove what originally made them successful. And instead, if they wanted something new, they should make something new. But that means launching a property without a built-in fan base, right? Without an existing canon to mutilate. It means having to take a risk, and you can't have it both ways. So instead, they remake the franchises while changing a lot that originally made them successful, which kind of jabs at the original fans. But you need the original fans' money, so you have to keep them happy. And how do you do that? Well, with a term I've come to really dislike: fan service. Now, to me, fan service means keeping your promise to the fans. Too often, storytellers nowadays want to subvert fan expectations, and if you do it well, it can be kind of cool. But lately, they've been subverting expectations by badly executing their storytelling. Yep, you promised me a great adventure and instead completely screwed it up. Expectations subverted. That's not a good thing. Like if I go to a steak joint and order Wagyu and you bring me a PB&J sandwich, you've subverted my expectations. But I'm never going to come to your restaurant ever again, no matter what names you call me. But what people think fan service means is making a series of callbacks that are meant for the original fans. In other words, what South Park calls member berries, nostalgia. And that's why a lot of modern soft reboots, remakes are burdened with tons of nostalgia. And as much as I want to go see Ghostbusters Afterlife, and I relish the thoughts of what that movie, the potential in that movie, I already know it's going to be mired in callbacks and nostalgia for fans of the original 1984 Ghostbusters. The trailers already show that. And it's rife with Easter eggs and everything like that. And I think I'm going to enjoy it because I'm Gen X. And it's kind of, even though it's made for a new audience, they have to placate me by throwing all that stuff in there. And I'll walk out with a bounce in my step, I'm pretty sure. But with that, we've kind of come full circle. And if you've hung in here through my rambling, then thanks. I just needed to kind of get this off my chest. There's a deeper theme in here somewhere, but I don't know what it is right now. And here's a quick recap, a sort of too long didn't read version for folks who made it this far, although I probably should have put it at the beginning of the podcast. Well, here we go. So some methods of storytelling are more effective than others at conveying lasting meaning. The way to disseminate lasting meaning and real change across a society is to maximize the number of people who experience the story. And the way to maximize the audience is to ensure the story appeals to the most amount of people possible. And that just happens to coincide with substantial financial rewards. But though many storytellers profess to want to maximize their income and reach the broadest audience, they tend to be working in direct opposition to these stated goals by taking existing successful stories and changing them from what made them successful and into thinly veiled propaganda, alienating large portion of the existing audiences instead of taking new risks with new stories. And they're trapped between pleasing old existing fans who have the disposable income and recruiting new fans, for whom many of these franchises are just old things their parents made them watch. And they use nostalgia and love for the original series for marketing and to cover up that their new versions of their old stories aren't that successful. They're just not that good. And if you want to tell something new, you have to make something new. You have to take risks. You can't have it both ways. Instead, I think they aren't acting in good faith. They're sucking franchises dry of everything that is good and leaving them damaged, if not destroyed, like vampires. And that's not a good thing when modern mythic stories are killed off for a quick buck. And you can extrapolate that to cover what I said about what happens to societies that tell bad stories. And that the ability to tell good and long-lasting fictions are survival traits to a civilization. And that all of us should be getting worried about the state of stories, both mythic and quote-unquote true, in our modern age. And on a personal note, if stories are kind of a software patch for our brains, shouldn't we be a little bit more careful who we let write the code? Now, the question we're left with is, why are they doing this? I don't exactly know. But again, they've kind of told us in the new myths. And to that end, there is at least one creator out there who understands that as long as franchises remain lucrative, the remakes won't end. They'll keep getting watered down and altered and made worse and worse until all the magic has been stripped off their unrecognizable and desiccated corpses. And this man, this visionary, knowing that he would be hated in his own time, has gambled everything to personally mar and damage every franchise he can. He has allies now, and like locusts, they exploit the corporation's desire for short-term profits at the expense of lasting stories. And they're moving from franchise to franchise, leaving storytelling ruin in their wake. And this man is our franchise John Galt. Not the hero we need, but in our self-loathing, the hero we deserve. He is a disobedient automaton, a naughty android, a bad robot. Let the past die. Kill it if you have to. Remember that? I remember. Just make sure you get all their money first.
Mountains in the way couldn't keep us from the sea. Here we stand, open arms. This is home where we are, ever strong in the world that we made.
have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are brought to you by The Fat Rat. The song you are hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brehm. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.